So from Brandeis University, welcome to Recall This Book, where we assemble scholars and writers from different disciplines to make sense of contemporary issues, problems, and events.
I'm John Plotz, and my returning guest today is Martin Puchner, professor of English, theater, and comparative literature at Harvard.
An editor of more than one Norton anthology and author of many prize-winning books, among them The Written World. So this is another installment of our Books in Dark Times series, which, as you probably know by now if you're listening to this, explicitly takes its inspiration from Hannah Arendt's Men in Dark Times, which proposes that even in the darkest of times, we have the right to expect some illumination, and that such illumination may well come less from theories and concepts. So I think there's an anti-theory move here. Then from the uncertain, flickering, and often weak light that some men and women in their lives and their works will kindle under almost all circumstances. So, we're conceived in the belief that that's true, that there's kindling out there, even at a dark moment. And especially at a dark moment, we want to know what brings people like you, Martin, and like you, dear listener, comfort and joy. So we invite you to draw up a chair and listen, and then also please to send us your own thoughts about books that you have been turning to at this particular moment. So Martin, I gave you some kind of softball questions to get the ball rolling. So if you remember, the starters were simply, what books are you reading that are giving you comfort and why, or giving you joy and why?
Yeah. So the first book I turned to a few weeks ago, and events are moving so fast that I no longer think that that's a great choice. But then it seemed like a good book, and a lot of people were talking about it, is The Decameron by Boccaccio. And this came up because I was teaching a world literature course, and one of the texts there we were reading was not The Decameron, but 1001 Nights, the framed tale narrative with all kinds of stories within it. And so it was one of the last in-person lectures I delivered. Yeah. And since I was talking about framed tale narratives, of course, my mind immediately went to Decameron, whose frame story, as you know, and as many people know, is a plague. And so this group of aristocrats withdraw to the countryside to spend the time telling stories, all different kinds of stories, to pass the time, as in the outside world, the bodies are piling up. And it seemed like a good thing to talk about.
It's mid 14th century. It's a time when there were a lot of plagues, I guess. Is it? Yeah.
Exactly. Coming from Asia, as it happens. Not all plagues come from Asia, but this one did.
One did. Yeah.
And it celebrates the power of storytelling, because that's how they, spent their time, very much the way, we spent the time streaming Netflix and listening to podcasts.
Yeah. But so Martin, just to push the analogy to 1001 Nights, it's the power of storytelling because it's what they're doing as a pasatiempo, like just to pass the time while waiting. But 1001 Nights has a much stronger claim, because Scheherazade, actually, her stories are what keep her alive, right? But that's not true of the Decameron, right? There's no suggestion that there's an anti-plague quality to the...
No, it's the stories. That would be interesting to have the stories actually ward off the plague.
I bet there's an Italo Calvino in which there must be an Italo, the story itself could annihilate the plague. Yeah.
Yeah. Except perhaps only that it, telling these stories keeps them from going crazy, which we all, sheltering at home.
Yeah.
So it's very hard.
Yeah. In fact, my co-host, Elizabeth Ferry, was just talking about reading Journal of the Plague Year, which I bet is another book you thought about. And she made the point that Journal of the Plague Year, his problem, the central character's problem, is that he just will not shelter in place. Like, he keeps going out, even though he knows it's dangerous. And so that's a really good point. So the Decameron does suggest, well, here's actually a thing you can do. Like, you can, how to Netflix your life on your own. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. But as I said, that seemed, and this seemed like a good idea 3 weeks ago. But I have to say, in the last week, I have turned, I guess I've become like a character in Boccaccio, in that I have turned to pure escapism. And so my drug of choice is P.G. Wodehouse, whom I love, and I've read, I think, the entire oeuvre, even the early cricket novels and short stories, which are
that's
not
impressive.
great pieces of literature, but it's just, he's the perfect stylist. And in his world, nothing bad ever happens.
Yeah.
These are novels set in a very rarefied, high aristocratic world in Britain, and some also in New York. He's actually buried on Long Island. It's really strange. Years ago, a friend who, in suburban Long Island took me by his grave, and it seems like the last place you would expect it, because it's all about castles and London high society.
Most of them are written in America, right? Isn't that right? Or
I'm not sure actually whether that's the case, but he certainly spent significant time here and died here. And some of his novels are partially or entirely set in the United States.
Okay. So Martin, one of the big axes we've been exploring. So first of all, we've had, I think, 5 conversations, and in 4 of them, P.G. Wodehouse has come up.
No, really?
Yeah. So you've got your finger on the pulse of the glitterati, which is great. But we've been talking about kind of an axis between, I guess, relevance and escape. I suppose that's it. So it sounds like you started with something that's actually not very directly relevant. It's not as if you were reading a book about like pandemic or something, but you started with a book that had an immediate frame, an envelope that was plaguish, and then you ended up escaping. Is that fair?
Right.
So do you have any thoughts about the meaning of the word comfort and the word joy in this context? Basically, at this point, only comfort is giving you joy. Is that what you would say?
Well, comfort, I mean, that may be a good way of putting it. And though, I mean, the thing about P.G. Wodehouse, it's not fluffy. It's not feel good. It's incredibly precise. The prose is incredibly precise. So it's this incredibly shiny, super well crafted world in which, if you dig language, you can enter and enjoy every sentence and the pacing of it and the turns of phrases and all of that. So it's not so much feel good, I would say, but it's this, concoction, this incredibly elaborate and artful and artificial concoction that you can enter and enjoy, and it is definitely a distraction in some sense, but it's not fluffy feel good.
Okay, so I'm gonna put you on the spot as German-born literature professor. So P.G. Wodehouse and Thomas Mann are virtually contemporaries, but you would never have thought of reading Thomas Mann at this point.
I have to confess I didn't, but then, again, about, was it 2.5 or 3 weeks ago when Stephen Greenblatt wrote this piece in the New Yorker, which I like very much, where he starts with Journal of the Plague Year and the Decameron, but then he was in Italy and he just returned on one of the last flights to Italy.
I haven't read this.
And he said really what it seemed to him at the time, this was at least 3 weeks ago, what Italy seemed to him like was not like Boccaccio with the piling up corpses, which of course is what Italy is now, or Journal of the Plague Year, but Thomas Mann's death in Venice. It's interesting because this is set in Venice during the cholera, but that fact only forms the backdrop of the novel, which is really about this infatuation of this older man with this younger man. So it's more, so I think Stephen's point was really that there was something oblivious about it, that in this novel, the main character, they should care about the cholera, but they actually can't and don't, because they're obsessed with something else. So no, so this is not my reading. I didn't think of that. But I think it's a strong point. And again, for the time, 3 weeks ago, seemed very timely.
Yeah. No, well, now you're making me think of another novel that I really love, and you and I have never discussed this, but Hermann Hesse's last novel, The Glass Bead Game. Or Magister Ludens, I think it's sometimes called. Are you a fan of that book, or?
I think I haven't read it since I was 17, and I have to admit I don't remember it particularly well.
So I totally sympathize with anyone who read Hesse at 17 and thinks he's just completely full of shit, because I know a lot of the early books are just kind of bloviating about his kind of highly filtered conception of Germanic Buddhism or something. But Glass Bead Game was written in Switzerland, where he was in exile, though it's sort of not exactly clear why he was in exile, but, you know, he did leave Germany during the war. And it's about this world where people just play this game rather than engage in politics, except that somehow the game itself becomes a form of replacement politics, but always an inward-looking one. So on some level, it feels like it's very directly an allegory of living in Switzerland during the war, but it's an allegory of the escape into a deeply satisfying intellectual kind of fabrication, like confection, to use, or concoction, like you said, which nonetheless seems to have a kind of immanent hermeneutics, maybe, you know, so that it can be satisfying on its own terms.
You know, it's interesting that you mentioned the war. The other thing I've been reading, though not for pleasure or escape or whatever, dealing with what's going on, but for work, so to speak, is that I've been rereading works by the lost generation. So Hemingway's Movable Feast, Gertrude Stein's texts about Paris, the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, and other texts about Paris. And, you know, especially in Gertrude Stein's case, this is something, a work that covers her time both during World War I and World War II, and in, you know, and Movable Feast, part of that.
Oh, interesting.
And so, you know, I've been in my mind, when I read these works before, you know, the world of the war and all that entails seemed incredibly foreign and incredibly in the past, and I could never imagine experiencing anything like it. And of course, what we are going through is nothing like World War I or World War II, but one starts to comparisons. I found myself inevitably thinking about, okay, what are the statistical dangers in which, you know, Hemingway or Gertrude Stein or Alice B. Toklas are in? What are the forms of life disruption that this kind of convulsion brought with it, and so on and so forth. So it wasn't so much that I turned to these works, but I found that I read them in a completely different way now than I did before. I mean, the interesting thing about the lost generation, the way Gertrude Stein coins this term, or it's really a mechanic who says it, is it's interesting. He describes it, and this is something we can start to think about, something I've been thinking about a lot, is that the after effects of this generation coming home from the war, and of course there are, you know, great novels about shell shock and so on and so forth, but this phrase, the lost generation, is more general, that this is a generation that's been marked by this experience of World War I. And, you know, I've started to think about what will, and I had a conversation with a friend the other day who was thinking a lot, what will this generation, a young generation, on the theory that if you're young, experiences, you know, are that much more informative, how will this experience mark them?
So how about childhood books? Are there books you would go back to, or?
Well, you know, for me, it's not very interesting, but certainly Lord of the Rings is a childhood book that was very important for me. And I suppose I might return to that, or, you know, the movies, which I actually kind of like.
So what about like really old books, Martin? Like, are you tempted to just kind of go to a different world, like the Iliad or Gilgamesh? Or
you know, it's true. I've actually also, there was partially a work justification, but about 2 weeks ago, I started to read through a collection of ancient Egyptian literature. And that was actually also interesting because on the one hand, you know, these are small fragments because they're very old, but some of them are narrative. I mean, they're these old stories, but you certainly know, I mean, after, you know, like 80 or 90 pages, you realize things that are not surprising, but they take on different significance. For example, the incredible importance of the Nile and the flooding of the fields, which is a good thing. I mean, that's how the nutrients get into the fields. But certainly the precariousness of settled life that can be disrupted in the course I mentioned before, we had just been reading, of course, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and there, nature's revenge in some sense is an important theme. So so early Egyptian literature, I felt like I needed to read that anyway, and I thought it would take me into a completely different world, and it did. Though there too, you think about the locusts are coming, or the river is not playing along, or there are other disruptions. You just become very attuned to disruption.
Yeah. All right, Martin. Well, so is there one last book you want to talk about, like a book that?
Well, maybe and that too comes out of the course, and it's a book I care a lot about, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it was eerie because I taught it in the very beginning of the semester, and the way I teach it is basically as a witness to the earliest forms of urbanization, urban living.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Set in the city of Uruk, King Gilgamesh is praised as the rebuilder of the city walls. And Uruk happens to be one of the first cities in the world, even as long as 8,000 years ago, managing to concentrate 50,000 people in one small space. And this was made possible by intensive forms of agriculture and animal husbandry. And so this is, and Jared Diamond in Guns, Germs, and Steel talks about this. This is the world we live in.
That's when we all ruined our digestion, The seed of all future celiacs was set in the cereal eating.
But also, it is the condition under which then certain illnesses, viruses, jump from animals to humans.
Yeah.
And so, in a way, I think that here again, the Epic of Gilgamesh it's not about disease; it's about a flood, which is very different. Yeah. But it is you have to read it against the grain, or before the background of this is a text.
So in other words, if Enkidu comes out as the hero, then if we'd all just stayed wild men like Enkidu, we would have been fine.
Yeah.
And can he talk to the animals before he lays with the priest?
He lives with it. He lives with the animals.
Yeah.
And probably
he's somehow in communion with them or something. Yeah.
So
man. All right.
Really about concentrations of humans and animals, and everything that results from it.
Well, oh my God, Martin, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure. So I'll just say, Recall This Book is hosted by John Plotz and usually Elizabeth Ferry, with music by Eric Cheslow and Barbara Cassidy, and sound editing by Claire Ogden, website design and social media by Callista Ross. So you can leave us a comment on this post to start the conversation, or if you're inspired, you can voice record your thoughts, email them to us at recallthisbookpod@gmail.com, and we might include them in an upcoming episode. We'd also love to hear from you on our various social media accounts via Instagram, Recall This Book, Facebook, Recall This Book Pod, at Twitter, and you could use the hashtag Books in Dark Times, or a photo of a book you've recently turned to for comfort and joy, and then you can check out what others are currently reading. So from all of us here, Martin, thanks a ton, and thank you for listening.